Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clay, and I am the Bucks believer. Tomorrow night, Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals between the Milwaukee Bucks and the Atlanta Hawks will be tipping off. With that being said, I think it's about time that I give my preview and prediction for how I think this series will go. Let's start by talking about what happens when the Bucks are on offense and the Hawks are on defense. The biggest question for Atlanta on this side of the court has to be how they will defend the two-time MVP Giannis Antetokounmpo. I actually think that the answer to this question is fairly straightforward. The Hawks are more than likely going to have to open up this series with their starting center, Clint Capela, as the primary defender on Antetokounmpo. Capela is well suited for this matchup in my opinion. Clint does a solid job of moving his feet on the perimeter, so if Atlanta does ask him to move out and you guard Giannis on the three-point line, he's not going to be dead meat because he moves his feet exceptionally well relative to other players at the center position. That's likely not going to be the case, as the Hawks probably will be okay with letting Giannis operate at the three-point line as much as possible. So what's really going to be important is what happens when Antetokounmpo puts his head down and decides to get to the basket. The way Capela guards him there will determine how successful Giannis can be in this series. I actually think that Clint has a solid shot at slowing Giannis down on these drives. Capela has established himself as one of the league's premier rim protectors over the past couple of seasons, and I don't see any reason why that would change when he's being attacked by Giannis. Antetokounmpo is obviously going to be able to finish at a higher rate than the average player would against Capela, but I still think that Clint is going to be able to do a solid job of slowing Giannis down a little bit from what we saw at least in the last series against the Brooklyn Nets. In addition to being a quality defender on Giannis, Capela guarding Antetokounmpo is also going to allow him to stay close to the paint because he's not going to have to guard Giannis on the perimeter when Antetokounmpo is off of the ball. This will allow Capela to play that rim protector role even when Giannis isn't handling it, which is a great recipe for success for the Hawks because Capela is an excellent help side defender and his rim protection could potentially slow down what the Bucks off-ball players are able to do when Giannis kicks it out to them. Attacking closeouts is much more difficult when your eventual drive is greeted by a 6'10" stymier of shot rejections, so I do think that Capela has a chance to really make an impact on this series guarding Giannis. The one issue with Clint is he could get in foul trouble, as Antetokounmpo is going to be attacking him with reckless abandon throughout this series. If Capela plays too physical on his contests on Giannis, we could see those fouls start to rack up for Clint, and that could lead to Atlanta having to go in another direction. They do have some other solid options to put on Giannis. However, my favorite of those options is probably John Collins. Collins isn't as strong as Capela, and he's not as good of a shot blocker, but he is a solid charge taker, and he plays physical enough that he should be able to prevent Giannis from getting to the basket each and every time. That charge-taking potential with Collins is probably the biggest asset he brings to the Hawks as a Giannis defender, as if he can draw offensive fouls with any frequency on Antetokounmpo, it could lead to the Greek Freak getting into some foul trouble, which would obviously be a giant plus for the Hawks. Outside of Collins, the other two guys I think could see time on Giannis are Danilo Gallinari and Onyeka Okongwu. However, neither of these two players is quite strong enough to really be a viable option guarding Giannis, so I think we most likely see a lot of Capela and a lot of Collins on that Giannis matchup for the Hawks throughout this series. The second question I have for the Hawks on their defensive end of the court is how they will hide Trae Young. Young is a fantastic player, especially on the offensive end of the court, where he's debatably one of the 10 best players in the entire league. Unfortunately for Atlanta, Young does have his drawbacks, and the main one of those is his play on the defensive end of the court, where his slight frame and sometimes lassitude for playing defense can put him in trouble. That lassitude level has gone far down, as Young has played with a lot of energy on defense in the playoffs, but he's still a really small dude, and that can lead to him being taken advantage of on the defensive end of the court. I think the most likely and the obvious, of course, hiding spot for Trae Young in this series is going to be defending PJ Tucker. Tucker mostly just stands in the corner or at the dunker spot and either finishes layups or knocks down corner three-pointers for the Bucks. Outside of that, he doesn't have too much involvement in Milwaukee's offensive scheme. This makes him an ideal hiding spot for Young on the defensive end of the court. For the Bucks, I do think there are some ways they could take advantage of Trae guarding PJ. One of these is Tucker's ability to crash the offensive glass. So far this postseason, he's averaging 2.1 offensive rebounds per game, and he genuinely does a great job of fighting for those offensive boards and can come away with some really tough loose balls. He has a 5-inch, 50-pound advantage on Young, so that could bode very well for Tucker when it comes to grabbing offensive rebounds. In addition to the offensive rebounding, Tucker could also be used more often as a screener. This isn't really something that we've seen much from Milwaukee in the past, but if push comes to shove and they need to use Tucker more often to create mismatches, PJ is an excellent screener because of his physicality and size, and we could see Hawks defenders get hung up on those screens. I think a PJ Tucker, Chris Middleton screening action could be particularly successful for the Bucks, as Middleton will probably be guarded by a perimeter player such as Bogdan Bogdanovic or Solomon Hill throughout this series. If those players get caught on the screen by Tucker, it could force a switch from Atlanta, which would leave Middleton isolating against Trae Young. That's almost an immediate recipe for disaster when it comes to the Hawks' hopes on defense, so they're probably going to have to avoid that at all costs. Well, Trae Young's obvious hiding spot in this series is on PJ Tucker. As I've just outlined, there are some ways for the Bucks to take advantage of that. Trae could also spend time defending Pat Connaughton or Bryn Forbes whenever those two bench players are on the court for the Bucks. I do think that the Bucks can also take advantage of that with some dribble handoff plays with Giannis Antetokounmpo as the ball handler, and Forbes/Connaughton coming off of that handoff for either a curl and a layup or an open three-pointer. But for the most part, I think Young probably defends Tucker throughout this series. And as I talked about before, Tucker could set screens on Middleton's defender to create a mismatch with Trae Young guarding Chris Middleton. However, I don't necessarily think that Chris is going to need that screen because Chris is probably going to have a mismatched player on him for the most part in this entire series. That's because the Hawks are missing their two best perimeter defenders in DeAndre Hunter and Cam Reddish. Each of these two guys has been injured for extended periods of time, and I believe that both of them will be out for the rest of this series. This could cause a lot of trouble for the Hawks as they are left without a true perimeter stopper to put on Middleton. I think Bogdan Bogdanovic likely starts off the series with this as his matchup, but Bogdan is not even playing at the level that he usually can on defense, where he's at least an average on-ball defender because he's been hampered by some knee soreness in recent games. That could lead to Middleton going off when he's guarded by Bogey, and the other options in the Hawks rotation to defend Middleton at the wing position, Kevin Huerter and Danilo Gallinari, are likely in even more trouble than Bogdanovic would be. The Hawks could try some players that are further on their bench in Solomon Hill and Tony Snell. I think that each of those two guys could do a decent job of guarding Chris and preventing him from getting the open mid-range jumpers that he prefers to shoot. But those two players both really hurt what the Hawks are trying to do on the offensive end of the court. So I believe that Atlanta would likely try to refrain from playing those two guys. In the end, they might be forced into it because they don't have a good option to guard Chris Middleton, and the same of that is true with their matchup on Jrue Holiday. I have a lot less confidence in Holiday as a scorer because, as we saw in the last series against the Brooklyn Nets, Holiday can really struggle on the offensive end of the court at times. He also has a much higher load on the defensive end of the court than Middleton does, as he's primarily going to be defending Trae Young in this series, which will likely take a lot out of Jrue. However, when Holiday is attacking on the offensive end of the court, he's going to have some solid matchups. I think Kevin Huerter likely starts off the series on him, and we could see Jrue really bully Kevin when he tries to get to the basket. In addition to that, Holiday also could take advantage of some matchups against the Hawks' backups, particularly Lou Williams, who has been the backup point guard for the Hawks throughout this playoff series. Williams is a really solid scorer on the offensive end of the court, but he struggles on defense, and he's the type of matchup that we could see Holiday really exploit if that's the type of role that Jrue is asked to step into for the Bucks. The next guy I want to discuss is Brook Lopez because his role in this series is a little bit unclear. I think he's probably going to be defended by John Collins or Onyeka Okongwu throughout this series because the best option the Hawks have to defend him in Clint Capella will be occupied guarding Giannis Antetokounmpo. Yeah, Brook probably could post up either Collins or Okongwu, but I think it's likely that he passes on that because the Bucks simply have better options in their offense to create easy looks. Lopez will probably be most useful as a spacer on the perimeter and as a crasher on the offensive glass for the Bucks in this series. If he's able to make those little plays like he did against the Nets, he could still allow them to be much more successful on offense, particularly if he can knock down his three-pointers as he did against Brooklyn in Game 7, where he went 3 for 4 from beyond the arc. Outside of the Bucks starters, I think it's important to call into question what role their bench can play in this series. The guy who probably will play the most minute for the Bucks off the bench in this series is probably Pat Connaughton. Connaughton had a really solid series against the Nets, and he even played upwards of 30 minutes in a couple of the matchups for the Bucks against Brooklyn. In this series, Pat will likely be asked to do a lot of the same things he did against the Nets. He's going to shoot open shots like he did against Brooklyn, and he's also going to be asked to defend at a high level. On some occasions, he'll be asked to guard on-the-ball players like Kevin Huerter and sometimes maybe even Trae Young, as I talked about in my video yesterday. But most of the time, he's going to have to be a solid off-the-ball defender and make sure that he cannot be exploited in mismatches. I think Connaughton is the best option for the Bucks off the bench, and he'll probably play somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes per game in this series. Bryn Forbes is the second guy for the Bucks off the bench, and while I think he could have more of a role in this series than he did against the Brooklyn Nets last round, I still don't exactly see him having a huge spot in this series. The reason for that is the Hawks' dearth of quality perimeter offensive players. Forbes is a below-average defender on that end of the court, and that could lead to him not really having a great hiding spot. So, considering that I don't see a great place for the Bucks to hide him, I don't see a big role for him on defense. He is going to play, and he's going to knock down some shots for the Bucks as one of the best floor spacers in the NBA, but because of his defensive troubles, I don't see him playing much more than 12 or 13 minutes per game in this series for the Bucks. The next guy here is Bobby Portis, who we saw completely fall out of the Bucks rotation in the series against Brooklyn. I think that he will probably have less defensive problems against the Hawks than he did last series, but he's still probably toast when he's trying to guard Trae Young in the pick and roll. I do think that if the Bucks can match up Portis' minutes with Okongwu's minutes, that could be a positive development for them because Onyeka is much less of a lob threat in the pick and roll than the two starters for the Hawks at the big man positions and Collins and Capella are. So that could lead to Portis having much less of an important job guarding that pick and roll. But in general, I don't see Bobby playing much more than 10 or 12 minutes per game in this series, and if this series is really close, we could see Bobby fall out of the rotation altogether, similar to what happened last round. The next guy here is Thanasis Antetokounmpo. I don't see Thanasis playing much more than the end of the quarters, so it's pretty safe to move on. Finally, with Jeff Teague, I think he probably doesn't play at all in this series. Teague doesn't really do too well on the defensive end of the court, and considering the Hawks have multiple point guards that can take advantage of that in Trae Young, Kevin Huerter, and Lou Williams, I just think that this is not the right series for Jeff Teague to be getting playing time. Finally, let's move on and talk about what happens when the Hawks are on offense and the Bucks are on defense. The biggest thing for the Bucks here on the defensive end of the court is what they do to defend Trae Young. I made an entire video on that yesterday, so if you want to listen to me talk more about this series, go check that out. But I'll sum that up by saying that I think the Bucks use a variety of options on Trae, specifically Jrue Holiday, Chris Middleton, Pat Connaughton, and PJ Tucker. I think each of those guys could have some success, but the two best options for the Bucks are Holiday and Middleton, and considering Middleton probably spends more time on the Hawks' wings, this is probably a Jrue Holiday matchup. The way the Bucks defend that pick and roll with Young and Collins/Capella is going to be very key to their defense, and if Young is able to get it going, he could really make the Bucks pay on that end of the court. Like I said, more on that Young Capella pick and roll in my video from yesterday, so go check that out if you want to hear about that. The next big key for the Hawks on their offensive end of the court is what happens with Bogdan Bogdanovic's health. Bogdanovic has been hindered by some knee soreness in recent weeks, and that has led to his scoring going deep down for the Hawks in the last series against the Philadelphia 76ers. Bogdanovic could have a pretty big series for the Hawks against the Bucks, especially when you consider that this is a revenge series of sorts when the Bucks apparently tried to make a signing trade work for Bogdanovic this offseason. That ended up falling through, and so, while Bogdanovic was never technically a Buck, this could be considered a revenge series. Anyways, Bogey's health is key, especially because if he is healthy and playing at a high level, it could lead to the Bucks being forced to put their best wing defender in PJ Tucker on Bogey, which could open up some more opportunities for their other wings in guys like Danilo Gallinari and Kevin Huerter. Speaking of Huerter, I do think that he could have a solid series, but once again, he's going to be challenged with some excellent perimeter defenders. I think Chris Middleton probably starts out the series guarding Kevin, and that could be quite troublesome for Huerter because he was mostly successful against the Philadelphia 76ers in the last series for the Hawks when he was defended by smaller players like Seth Curry. When he's instead guarded by Middleton, who is about 5 inches taller than Curry and infinite times better on the defensive end of the court, I don't think that Kevin can have the same level of success. However, he does still have the best nickname in the entire NBA. I love you, Red Velvet, and you're probably the only player for the Hawks that I'll be rooting for to have success in this series just because of that awesome nickname. Anyways, getting back on track, the next guy to talk about here is Danilo Gallinari. Gallinari is maybe the most interesting non-Trae Young player on the Hawks for me in this series, and that's because the role he plays could vary quite a bit. I think that for the Bucks, the primary option that they're going to want to have guarding Gallo is PJ Tucker. This is because Gallinari is a jump shot focused player who doesn't do a whole lot of beating his man off the bounce. We just saw Tucker do a great job in guarding the best option in that player type in Kevin Durant last series. So whenever possible, I think Tucker probably guards Gallinari. When that isn't the case for the Bucks, they'll try to put Giannis Antetokounmpo on Gallo. But there are going to be times when neither of those players are on the court. In that case, I think the Hawks could really take advantage of some mismatches with Gallinari because if Bobby Portis or a smaller player like Middleton are guarding Gallo, that is not good for Milwaukee as Gallinari does a great job of punishing those players in mismatches. I don't think that there's going to be too much time where Giannis and PJ are both off the court, but in those cases, I definitely think that the Hawks should look to get Gallinari going. Another way they could get their floor spacing big man going is by playing him at the 3 more instead of the 4. This is a move they went with quite frequently in their series against the Philadelphia 76ers, and it worked to great effect against Philly. Unfortunately for Atlanta, I don't think that it works all that well in their series against Milwaukee. Theoretically, the lineup of Trae Young, Kevin Huerter, Gallinari, Collins, and Capella could work well for Atlanta on the offensive end of the court especially, but when you consider the defensive end and the fact that they have too many guys that they need to hide and not enough low-quality Bucks offensive players to hide them on, it puts Atlanta in a stressful situation. They probably are going to have to put Young on PJ Tucker, and if they do that, who are they going to hide Gallinari on? Holiday? Probably not. Middleton? Not good for Atlanta either. So I think the Hawks are probably going to have to play Gallo at the 4 when he is out there, and because of that and the fact that he overlaps with John Collins positionally, I think that Gallinari is going to have to take on a smaller role in this series than he did in the last one. There is a path to winning for the Atlanta Hawks in this series. They need Clint Capella to stay out of foul trouble and to slow down Giannis as much as he possibly can. They also need Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday to miss shots. I think those guys are going to be able to generate good looks because they're guarded by inferior perimeter players on the Hawks end of the court. But if they struggle to make shots, as they did at times in the Brooklyn series, we really could see that benefit the Hawks quite a bit. Atlanta also needs Trae Young to cook the Bucks in the pick and roll, and they need their other perimeter players to get hot shooting the ball from the perimeter. I think that'll happen at least once, as the Hawks do have a really solid team that has proven itself time and time again throughout this playoffs. Unfortunately for Atlanta fans, I do think that this is a bad matchup for the Hawks as they just don't have the perimeter defenders necessary to slow down Chris Middleton. So I think this is going to be a huge series for Chris, and I think that along with Giannis potentially having some success when guarded by Capella, and the Bucks having a really good matchup on the defensive end of the court, probably equates to the Bucks winning this series in 5 games. So that's my final prediction right there. Be sure to let me know what your prediction for this series is in the comments section down below. Let me know why you think that as well, because I love to interact with you guys in the comments. It's a lot of fun. Also, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, especially if you are a fellow Bucks believer. This is the place for you. I think that I've covered everything that I wanted to cover, so that's going to be it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all again very soon.